What happens when a late-night interview spirals from lighthearted fun into something far more personal and hostile? What unfolded on Jimmy Kimmel Live wasn't just an awkward segment. It was a full-blown late-night meltdown that left audiences speechless, and one of comedy's biggest stars walking off set mid-show, Kevin Hart, known for his charm, quick wit, and ability to laugh along with nearly any joke, found himself blindsided in a moment that many are now calling one of the most uncomfortable in late-night history. The air turned tense, the smiles faded, and by the end of it, viewers were left questioning just how far Jimmy Kimmel is willing to go for a laugh. Before we get into the blow-be-blow of what went down that night, be sure to hit the subscribe button and drop a comment below. What do you think happens when celebrity interviews go too far? The evening began like any other on Jimmy Kimmel Live. Kevin Hart was the featured guest there to promote his latest comedy special. The studio was electric with anticipation. Hart had been on the show several times before, and his past appearances had always been playful, warm, and full of laughs. But something felt off. From the moment Hart stepped onto the stage, there was an unspoken tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Hart," Kimmel announced with his trademark flair but listen closely, and you could hear a sharpness in his tone that didn't quite match the usual welcome. Hart, ever the professional, bounded out with his signature grin and wave. Kevin Kimmel repeated as they sat down. "Always good to have you back, though I gotta say, you look a little different tonight." Hart chuckled. "Different? How, Jimmy? You mean more handsome than usual?" The audience laughed, but Kimmel's comeback chilled the room. "No, I mean you look tired. Really tired. Like, are you getting enough sleep, or are you just getting old?" That wasn't banter. That was a jab. Hart's smile faltered for the first time. "I'm doing great, man," he replied, still trying to keep the mood light. "Been working hard, staying busy. You know how it is." But Kimmel didn't ease up. "Working hard or hardly working? Because I heard about your last movie. And let's just say, the box office numbers weren't exactly lighting it up." The laughter died down. The crowd, once playful, now sat in awkward silence. Hart shifted in his seat, his instincts kicking in. "Hey, not every movie's a grand slam," he said with a grin. "That's why it's called show business, not show friendship, right?" Rather than meeting the joke with grace, Kimmel pushed even further. "But when you're pulling in $20 million a movie, don't you think audiences deserve more than just showing up and being fell short?" The jab at Hart's height drew a sharp reaction not just from Hart, but from the stunned studio. Height jokes had long been part of Hart's act, but this one didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a dig, a cheap one. "Wow," Hart said quietly, his tone now serious. "We're really going there tonight, huh?" "Going where?" Kimmel replied, feigning innocence. "I'm just making conversation. Isn't that what you comedians do, make jokes about everything?" There's a difference between making jokes and being disrespectful. "Jimmy," Hart said, his voice steady but visibly strained, "we've known each other for years. Man, what's this really about?" The tension in the studio was unbearable. Audience members squirmed. Crew members exchanged nervous glances. Kimmel didn't let up. In fact, he doubled down. "Look, Kevin, I'm just saying what people are thinking. Your career peaked a few years ago, and now it kind of feels like you're coasting. When's the last time you did something actually funny instead of just loud?" The crowd went dead silent. It was a gut punch, and it was unnecessary. Hart leaned back, stunned. He didn't yell. He didn't retaliate with a roast of his own. He simply sat there, processing the moment. After a long pause, he shook his head, stood up from the chair, and with a quiet, "I'm good man," walked off stage. The camera lingered awkwardly on Kimmel, who, for once, had nothing to say. What began as a routine interview ended as a late-night disaster and a wake-up call for those who think there's no line in comedy. Was this Kimmel pushing boundaries or crossing one? Let us know in the comments. Jimmy Hart said slowly, steadying his voice, "I came here tonight to promote my work and have a good time with someone I thought was a friend. I don't know what's going on with you tonight, but this isn't cool." Kimmel chuckled and waved a hand, brushing it off. "Oh, come on, don't be so sensitive. You dish it out in your stand-up all the time. Surely you can take it when it comes back your way." Hart leaned forward, his voice tight. "There's a big difference between comedy and cruelty. Comedy lifts people up, but it brings laughter, even when it's edgy. But what you're doing, this feels personal. This feels mean." The mood in the studio shifted fast. What had started as a typical late-night exchange was now crackling with real emotion. The audience could feel it, the discomfort, the tension, the rawness. And Kevin Hart wasn't laughing anymore. Kimmel, visibly uncomfortable but still trying to maintain control, shrugged and pushed again. "Maybe the problem isn't me, Kevin. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle hearing the truth about where your career really is." That was the breaking point. Hart stood up slowly from his chair. The room went dead silent. You could hear every creak of the studio floor as Kevin rose, staring down at Kimmel. Anger and disappointment etched across his face. Despite being the shorter man, in that moment, he seemed 10 feet tall. "Sit down, Kevin," Kimmel said, his voice now hollow, his confidence wavering. Hart didn't move. "No," he said, firmly and clearly. "This isn't a conversation anymore, Jimmy. This is you trying to humiliate me on national television for cheap laughs, for ratings, and I'm not going to sit here and play along." There was no mistaking the seriousness in his voice. It cut through the tension like a blade. He remained standing, staring down at the host, as the irony became impossible to ignore. Kevin Hart was the bigger man in every way that mattered. Kimmel gave a nervous laugh, trying to recover. "Come on, Kev, don't be dramatic. It's just TV. People expect a little back and forth." Back and forth. Hart's voice rose with disbelief. "Jimmy, there's a difference between playful banter and what you just did. You attacked my career, mocked my appearance, and questioned my talent in front of millions of people. That's not banter. That's not comedy. That's just straight-up cruel." The audience began to murmur. Whispers rippled through the studio. Phones came out. People knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. Kimmel, now visibly rattled, tried to regain ground. "Look, if you can't take a little criticism, maybe you're in the wrong business. Comedy's about being able to laugh at yourself. Don't lecture me about comedy," Hart snapped, eyes flashing. "I've been doing this for over 20 years. I've sold out arenas. I've starred in blockbusters. I've made millions of people laugh, and I've never had to tear anyone down to do it." He leaned in slightly. "What you're doing right now, that's not comedy, that's bullying." The word echoed, bullying. It hit the room like a gut punch. For the first time, Kimmel looked shaken, his face turned red. The studio lights suddenly felt hotter. The audience knew Hart was right. "I'm not bullying anyone," Kimmel said weakly. "I'm just trying to keep the interview interesting." Hart let out a bitter laugh. "Interesting? You think publicly humiliating your guests is interesting? You think tearing someone down for laughs is good television?" He stepped back and began removing his microphone. The gesture was clear. He was done. Offstage, producers scrambled, motioning frantically from behind the cameras, but there was no saving this moment. "It's Kevin." "Wait," Kimmel said suddenly. Serious, his voice tinged with real concern. "Don't walk off. We can move past this." Hart paused, mid-mic removal, and looked Kimmel dead in the eye. "Move past this," he repeated. "You just spent 10 minutes trying to tear me down. You mocked my success. You questioned my worth. You treated me like some nobody-like. I should be grateful just to be sitting across from you." He shook his head. "Why would I want to move past that?" "Because this is live television," Kimmel replied, sounding almost desperate. "Think about how this looks." "I am thinking about how this looks," Hart said. "It looks like a man who respects himself enough to walk away from someone who doesn't. It looks like a man who won't sacrifice his dignity for another person's spotlight." The audience sat frozen. No one moved. Hart's words rang with truth. As the confrontation reached its peak, one thing was undeniable. Kevin Hart had just drawn a line in the sand, not just for himself, but for every guest who's ever smiled through discomfort on a late-night couch. It was clear this wasn't just about one bad interview. What unfolded on Jimmy Kimmel Live felt like the breaking point tan eruption after years of subtle digs, public jabs, and private disrespect. Kevin Hart had finally reached the line, refused to let anyone, not even an old friend, cross. Kimmel, visibly rattled by the backlash in the room, made one final, desperate attempt to seize control. "Fine," he snapped. If you want to storm off like a child throwing a tantrum, go ahead. But don't blame me when people see this and say you can't handle the pressure." That was it. Hart calmly removed his mic, placed it neatly on his chair, and stood tall. No raised voice, no theatrics, just a quiet, burning intensity that cut deeper than any outburst ever could. "Jimmy," he said, his voice steady but charged, "I've handled pressure you couldn't even imagine. I've faced critics, bombed sets, failed publicly, still came back swinging. I've been doubted every step of the way. What I won't handle is disrespect, especially from someone I thought was a friend." He paused, locking eyes with the host. "And the fact that you think standing up for myself makes me childish, that says everything anyone needs to know about you." Hart turned toward the crowd, his entire presence shifting. The frustration melted away, replaced by the warmth and professionalism that made him one of the most beloved entertainers in the world. "I'm sorry you all had to see this tonight," he said sincerely. "You came here to laugh, to have a good time. And instead, you got caught in something ugly. That's not fair to you, and I apologize for my part in it." The audience, who had sat in stunned silence for most of the exchange, slowly began to applaud. First a few claps, then a wave. Within seconds, it turned into a standing ovation. They weren't just applauding Hart's professionalism, they were calling out the imbalance they'd just witnessed. They were choosing sides, and it wasn't Jimmy Kimmel's Kimmel watching. The crowd rallied behind his guest, tried to recover. "Kevin, please don't do this," he called after him. "Let's just finish the interview." Hart paused, looked back over his shoulder, and delivered a final line that would echo far beyond that stage. "There's nothing left to finish. Jimmy, you ended it the moment you chose to attack me instead of interview me." With that, he turned and began walking off set. The moment was chaos. Applause rang out, mingled with shouted support for Hart and a few loud boos aimed directly at Kimmel. The entire studio had turned from a talk show to something raw, unfiltered, and real. "Kevin, wait." Kimmel called out again, now standing behind his desk. "This is ridiculous. You're overreacting." Hart stopped in his tracks. He turned. Slowly, disbelief etched across his face. "Overreacting?" he said, staring Kimmel down. "Do you even hear yourself right now? After everything you just did, you still think I'm the problem?" Kimmel tried to backpedal, his tone still defensive. "I'm just saying maybe you're being a little too sensitive," the audience erupted. Boos echoed across the studio, heads shook in disapproval. Even a few crew members shifted awkwardly behind the cameras, visibly uncomfortable. Hart didn't return to his seat. Instead, he took a few steps forward and faced both the host and the audience head-on. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, clear and unwavering, "pay attention to what just happened here. Jimmy Kimmel spent 10 minutes tearing down my career, my work ethic, my character. When I defended myself, he called me dramatic. When I explained how wrong this was, he called me sensitive. And even now, he's still trying to make me the villain." The room held its breath. Hart scanned the faces in front of him, fans, crew, producers, and even Kimmel. "This is bigger than me. This is about how we treat people. About the difference between a joke and an insult. Between honesty and humiliation. You don't get to disrespect someone and then act surprised when they walk away." Another wave of applause swept the room louder, this time more purposeful. It was no longer just about supporting Kevin Hart. It was about rejecting the cruelty that had disguised itself as comedy for too long. Kimmel stood frozen behind his desk, the weight of the moment sinking in. Hart took one last look at the crowd and said softly, "Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for seeing me." And with that, he walked off stage, leaving behind one of the most uncomfortable, unforgettable, and culturally defining moments in late-night television history. "This is what happens," Kevin Hart said, his voice ringing through the silent studio. "When people think they can treat others like garbage and then blame them for not just accepting it." He turned slightly, his eyes never leaving Kimmel. "This is what happens when someone confuses having a platform with having a license to tear people down for entertainment." Jimmy Kimmel, visibly shaken and losing control of the moment, tried to shift his tone. "Kevin, I was just trying to create interesting television," he said. "Sometimes that means pushing boundaries." Hart's expression darkened. "Pushing boundaries?" he repeated incredulously. "Jimmy, There's a difference between pushing boundaries and crossing the line, between making compelling television and being deliberately hurtful. What you did tonight wasn't edgy, it was character assassination. The audience, once eager for laughs, now hung on every word, watching as Hart turned to them, his tone softening into something deeper, more personal. "I've been in this business a long time," he said, scanning the crowd, "and I've learned something important, how someone treats you when they think they have power over you. That tells you everything about their character." He paused. Then, with a glance back at Kimmel, "Tonight, Jimmy showed you his." A wave of applause broke through the studio, out, honest, and emotional. The crowd wasn't clapping for a punchline. They were clapping for truth. Kimmel, now growing desperate, leaned forward. "Look," he said, trying to salvage what little he could, "if I offended you, that wasn't my intention. Can't we just move on and finish the interview?" Hart slowly shook his head. "Jimmy," he said calmly, "you didn't offend me by accident. Every word you said tonight was calculated. You mocked my appearance, dismissed my success, and questioned my talent all while smiling like it was a joke." He narrowed his gaze. "That wasn't an accident. That was a choice." "But we're friends," Kimmel insisted weakly. "Harns," Hart shot back. "Friends don't humiliate each other on national television. Friends don't try to tear each other down for cheap laughs." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them slightly. "What you did tonight didn't come from a place of humor, it came from a place of contempt. You didn't treat me like a friend. You treated me like content." The truth of Hart's words landed hard. The audience, fully on his side now, remained completely silent, watching the unraveling. In real time, Kimmel, visibly pale, tried one last time. "Kevin," he said, softer now, "I'm sorry. If I went too far, can we please just sit down and talk?" Hart looked at him for a long moment, long enough for the whole room to feel it. His next words weren't angry, they were filled with quiet disappointment. "Jimmy, the time for talking was during the interview. That's when you should have shown respect. That's when you should have been professional." He took a breath. "But you didn't. You went for the spectacle. And now you want to apologize because it looks bad, because the audience didn't laugh the way you expected. That's not remorse. That's damage control." Hart turned toward the exit, then paused to address the audience one last time. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight," he said sincerely. "You deserved better than what happened on this stage, and I'm sorry my presence played a part in this mess. But I hope you understand sometimes you've got to stand up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable." That earned the loudest applause of the night. Many in the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering not out of pity, but in respect for a man who refused to be humiliated for someone else's ratings. As Hart reached the edge of the stage, Kimmel, out of options, threw out one last line. "Kevin, if you walk off this show, you'll never be invited back." Hart stopped. He turned slowly, and the look he gave Kimmel could have shattered glass. "Jimmy," he said, every word laced with steel, "after tonight, I wouldn't come back if you begged me. The way you treated me showed me exactly who you are, and I want nothing to do with that." And with that, Kevin Hart walked off Jimmy Kimmel Live, leaving behind what would become one of the most talked about moments in late-night television history. The applause didn't die down as he left, it grew louder. Meanwhile, Kimmel stood behind his desk, frozen, shaken, and exposed. The final minutes of the show limped on awkwardly, with Kimmel struggling to regain his composure as producers scrambled behind the scenes, but it was too late. The damage was done. And everyone in that studio and everyone watching at home knew they had witnessed something real. Kevin Hart's walk-off became an instant cultural moment, a symbol of self-respect, a refusal to stay silent in the face of public degradation. In an industry where humiliation often masquerades as entertainment, Hart drew a line. It wasn't about ego, it was about dignity, and in the end, it revealed a stark contrast. One man tearing people down for laughs, and another standing tall when it mattered most. What do you think about this unforgettable confrontation? Was Kevin Hart right to walk away, or should he have stayed to work it out? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shape entertainment history.